Richard Grabow was born in New York and first joined the ROTC program when he was in college. He served for 5 years in the Cold War. During his time in the war, he met his wife Avery, who worked for the Army. Since then, they have moved to California, and Mr. Grabow is a part of 2 veteran groups that go to many local schools and give presentations.
So, what is your name?
Richard Grabow, but call me Dick, and I was in the Cold War.
The Cold War occurred after World War II and was a fight for supremacy between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Tell us about your childhood.
My childhood, well, I was born in New York City, Brooklyn, and went to school in Brooklyn, elementary school, and then college in Brooklyn, and that's where I got interested in the Army. Because we had an ROTC program at the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, and so I volunteered for that. And in fact, I have a chart here that shows that this was a presentation that I gave to one of the schools. And that's actually a picture of me at 15 years old, which is about
the same age
which is about your age.
Yeah.
I had a full head of hair in those days. And but you see, you could see this was in 1949, and so I was. You can tell I was born then in 1934. So I'm 82 years old, so a little bit older than you guys. But the thing is, World War II was over for a few years, and I was actually too young for the Korean War. So that's the category that it put me in, you know, right smack in the Cold War.
What was your service in the war?
Well, it was in the Army, in the Corps of Engineers.
How long did you serve in the war?
Oh, well, I was in the Cold War for 5 years, but I spent 25 years in the reserves, and that was still during the Cold War. The Cold War didn't end until 1991, and I finished all my 30 years service in 1988.
Do you want to serve?
Oh, what made me want to serve?
Yeah.
Okay, well, actually, I was stimulated somewhat by my uncle. My uncle was a sergeant in the Army, and he was in the Pacific. And he was in some of the major battles in the Pacific, and whereas my father was 4F, meaning, you know, he had a physical disability that he couldn't go into the Army. So, but I really treasured my uncle's experience, and that was why, as soon as I had an opportunity to get involved in the military, it was because of him.
What age did you join the war?
Well, I came on active duty in 1957, so that means it would have been, I was age 23.
How did the war affect you?
Well, it was a Cold War, but there was always the threat of all-out war. You know, I was located over in Germany, and just on the other side of the border from us were the Russians and the East German troops. You know, these were the communist troops that were part of it's called the Warsaw Pact at that time, and we were a part of NATO, and it was a constant threat of war. It not only was maneuvers, you know, simulating war, but we participated in alerts. You know, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the siren would go off, and we'd head out to the field, it was we didn't know whether it was a real invasion or not, and so you know, there was some anxiety, but it wasn't like, you know, where you're day in and day out in combat. You know, it wasn't that kind of thing.
What were the living conditions in?
Well, we lived in Germany. We lived in dormitories. They were the old German dormitories. Some of them were pretty old. They they go back to World War One. And so you can imagine the plumbing was not working too good. But when we came over there we just took over the German barracks. We didn't build new ones over in Germany. We used the ones they had during World War II and like I said, World War One.
What was the hardest part about the war?
The hardest part? It was spending time out in the field, when we would go out for a maneuver or alerts or we did a lot of border patrol too. The hardest part was just living in the field, just we pitch a tent, and a lot of these maneuvers were in the wintertime. So it was just in the snow, you dig yourself a clear spot and set up your tent, So that was probably the hardest part.
What was the most memorable moment when you served in the war?
Memorable moment, well, it was probably when I was parachuting.
Mr. Grabow learned to parachute at Fort Benning by jumping out of airplanes called boxcars. They would jump out of both sides of the plane with 2-second intervals between jumpers. Since then, Mr. Grabow has completed more than 200 jumps and was awarded a parachuter badge.
What was training like?
Oh, training? Training was actually, in the Corps of Engineers, was quite good because we had some classroom training, but when we got down, this is after we were second lieutenants already, and we got down to Fort Belvoir, we trained in how to build bridges, buildings, field fortifications, airports, and then also trained with infantry weapons. We trained with machine guns and mortars and you name it. And the reason is because the Corps of Engineers, if you're a combat engineer, which is what I was considered, you have to be up in the front lines, You're generally working with the infantry, building bridges, and during an attack or a defense. And so we were trained in doing all those skills.
What else did you guys build?
Oh, what else?
Yeah.
Well, we built, in training, we actually built roads, We would actually mess up the German roads quite a bit because we had our tanks when we went on the maneuvers. These maneuvers would last about a month. You'd be living out in the field. You'd bring out your tanks. You'd bring out all your heavy equipment, and we damaged parts of the streets and some of the roads we went out on, and so we spent time working on roads.
It took you a long time.
And bridges, yeah.
And the Germans didn't like that one bit.
No, the Germans wanted us to pay for it, so.
Instead of paying for the roads that they ruined, they would fix them with their equipment.
Oh,
And the reason why we had all the equipment is that a lot of it was alerts that as I mentioned, they'd call, in the middle of the night, and we'd go out, and they wouldn't tell us whether it was a real invasion or whether it was just an alert, and so we'd take everything with us.
Mr. Grabow says they often wouldn't find out for 2 or 3 days whether it was an alert or a real invasion.
Do you have any artifacts or anything to show us?
Artifacts?
Pictures, anything?
I just have my uniform, which I wear when I go to schools. This is my shirt.
Unfortunately, the rifles, the guns, and the dress uniforms, when you move around the first few years, there is no room to save a dress uniform.
But these medals. This is the highest one. It's the Legion of Merit, and there's a write-up on the wall there about this medal here. And then these are achievement medals and Army commendation medals, and that's my rank, colonel, and that's my name tag there, and that's the Corps of Engineers, and that's my parachutist badge. Oh, that's my West Point hat. As part of my reserve duty for 13 years, I taught at West Point, and I'd go there as a reserve officer and train. There's a picture of me in there somewhere. Yeah, that's a picture of me at West Point. This is me here.
We appreciate the time Mr. Grabow took to talk to us, and we thank him for his bravery and his service.